Global trade. It's basically the invisible engine running our entire modern world. But what if that engine is structurally rigged? Welcome to this explainer on the architecture of global economic governance. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating and honestly deeply consequential argument. We're going to look at why a lot of critics and scholars argue that international institutions actually leave developing nations at a massive systemic disadvantage. And look, this isn't just dry academic economics. We are talking about the literal rules that dictate the wealth and poverty of entire continents. So picture a high-stakes poker game. We'll call this game international trade. But there is a massive catch. In this specific casino, the absolute richest player at the table doesn't just play their hand. They actually get to write the rules of the game. They get to hire the referee. They even get to decide who is allowed to pull up a chair. Now, according to political scientists, this isn't just a fun metaphor. This is the daily operating reality for dozens of countries across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Now, you've definitely heard of the big players here, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO. And if you read their brochures, they present themselves as totally neutral, technocratic referees, just impartial umpires calling balls and strikes for the global economy, right? Well, critics argue that when you look under the hood, the reality is very different. Instead of neutral umpires, you find a system designed and operated by the world's most powerful nations, imposing their own ideological agendas onto poorer countries. To really understand this, just look at the math. The United States remains the single largest shareholder in both the IMF and the World Bank. And because major structural decisions in these organizations require very specific voting thresholds, Washington effectively holds a veto. No developing nation, heck, not even a massive coalition of African or Asian nations, holds that kind of blocking power. The structural dominance is literally baked right into the founding architecture. And this kind of setup leads us straight into a classic economic trap. It's called the principal-agent problem. Think of it like this. You own a business, and you hire a manager to run it. You, the owner, want long-term growth and happy customers. But your manager, they just want a massive end of your bonus, so they slash the quality of your products to artificially boost short-term sales. The agent is pursuing their own interests instead of yours. So, how does this play out in global development? Well, scholars have pointed out that staff at places like the World Bank are frequently evaluated by the sheer volume of loans they push through. Their internal incentive, the agent's interest, is just growing that loan portfolio. But the principal's interest, the whole stated point of the bank, that's supposed to be reducing structural poverty. This creates a massive bias to just greenlight huge, expensive infrastructure projects that move a lot of cash, regardless of whether they actually help the local communities they're supposed to serve. Okay, so that's the money side. What about the legal side? Enter information asymmetry. Sounds super academic, but it basically just means one side has all the data and the other side is flying blind. In global trade disputes, it's exactly like a boxing match. Imagine a heavyweight champion walking into the ring with an entourage of elite trainers, lawyers, and dietitians going up against a solo rookie who took the bus to the arena alone. They are both playing by the same rules, sure, but the resources are completely unbalanced. And we saw this brutal asymmetry play out perfectly with the Cotton Four. That's Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, and Benin. These developing nations launched a massive campaign against U.S. cotton subsidies that were crushing their local farmers. They were going head-to-head with the U.S. Trade Representative, a heavyweight armed with literally hundreds of specialized trade lawyers. Now, incredibly, the Cotton Four actually won on the legal merits, but practically, the subsidies stayed in place for years. The Cotton Four simply didn't have the vast resources of the U.S. Treasury to actually enforce their victory. Which brings us to a huge realization, summed up perfectly by UC Davis professor Daniel Kono. He argues that the WTO doesn't actually enforce a strict legal system. Instead, it manages anarchy. In this system, there is no global police force to make you follow the rules. Compliance relies almost entirely on the threat of retaliation. Basically, if you are too small to hit back financially, the global rules are really just suggestions. Want proof? Take the tiny island nation of Antigua. They took the United States to the WTO over online gambling restrictions, and they unambiguously won. A total, clear-cut legal victory. So what happened? Washington largely just ignored it. Why? Because Antigua's entire economy is smaller than a single U.S. congressional district. They had absolutely zero leverage to enforce the judge's ruling. It was a flawless legal victory with zero real-world effect. But wait, let's contrast Antigua with 2002. The U.S. slapped heavy tariffs on imported steel. The WTO ruled those illegal too. But this time, Washington immediately backed down and complied. What was the difference? The complaining parties were economic giants like the European Union and Japan, and they threatened incredibly painful multi-billion-dollar retaliatory sanctions. The institution itself didn't enforce the law. The credible threat of massive economic pain did. And while these trade wars happen at the top, the policies pushed by these institutions leave a very real human cost on the ground. You see it over and over with structural adjustment programs, which usually demand severe austerity and rapid privatization. In the 1980s, Zambia saw its public health and education systems totally hollowed out. In 2001, Argentina, which was literally praised as an IMF model student, suffered a catastrophic $100 billion default. And we all remember Greece in the 2010s, facing crushing, creditor-driven austerity that completely overrode the democratic votes of its own citizens. But honestly, the most mind-blowing part of this whole explainer is the historical paradox. Economist Ha-Joon Chang calls it kicking away the ladder. He points out a glaring, massive hypocrisy. Wealthy nations are basically forcing developing countries to abandon the exact same economic policies they themselves used to get rich in the first place. Think about it. Historically, how did Britain and the United States build their empires? Massive tariffs to protect their young industries. How did South Korea achieve its economic miracle? State-directed credit. Yet, modern institutional rules explicitly forbid developing nations from using those exact tools. They demand radically open markets right out of the gate, policies the rich world only adopted way later, long after they had already secured their wealth. So this leaves us with the million-dollar question. If this global system is fundamentally anarchic, if power, leverage, and lawyers dictate the rules, what on earth can developing countries actually do? Are they just permanently stuck as captive customers, or is there a way to fight back? Well, Professor Kono's research points to a very specific strategic playbook. Rule number 1, turn your individual weakness into collective leverage. Think of OPEC, where individually vulnerable states banded together to coordinate scarcity and became a massive global force. Or the Cairns Group in agriculture. You have to negotiate through coalitions, build your own parallel institutions, and systematically weaponize reputational costs. Step 1 is already happening, building alternatives. $30 billion. That is the amount of loans already approved by the BRICS New Development Bank. This is a parallel institution created by the Global South to act as a direct alternative to the IMF and World Bank. It offers financing without those strict Western ideological conditions attached. And just by existing, it shatters the monopoly and finally gives developing nations a choice. Or look at the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AFCTA. Right now, because of old colonial trade routes, a lot of African nations actually trade more with Europe than they do with the country right next door. AFCTA is a massive experiment to change that, aiming to push intra-African trade from a measly 15% to over 50%. It's a brilliant strategy to build their own institutional architecture and keep wealth circulating locally. Finally, when it comes to those boxing matches at the WTO, developing nations have to team up to apply real economic pressure. Kano suggests things like launching synchronized multi-nation complaints. One tiny country complaining is easy to ignore. 50 filing at once is a political earthquake. They can also publish real-time data to control the narrative and even pool their retaliation rights together. Basically, if you can't punch hard alone, you hold hands and swing together. Ultimately, critics argue that if we want a global economy that actually works for everyone, we need real accountability and true representation. Which leaves us with this final thought for our explainer today. As the power dynamics of the 21st century shift, and as these new global South alliances gain strength, will developing nations continue to play at a rigged table? Or are they finally gathering enough collective leverage to flip the table entirely and rewrite the rules of global trade? Thanks for exploring this with us. Keep asking the big questions.